die. Go too fast. I'm taking 3.
I'm going for the St. Louis now.
Oh no!
Son of a bitch.
You get your 2?
Yeah. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Thotgor here, of course, and I am back. Yes, Halifax trip is over. So sad that it's over. I had a lot of fun. The museum was awesome. Really enjoyed it. And, saw some family. It was my niece's birthday, so I was down there for that as well. And saw some friends and did some partying, and that was awesome. So, now that we're back, now that my mind's all clear, we're going to take a look at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic, the different displays that they have, exhibits that they have, and the history behind it. And that's what this video is going to be focused on. I'm not going to be doing any gameplay in this video. It's purely historical information here, so we'll just jump right into it. Now, the layout of the video, what we'll do here is I'm going to first just we'll take a look at some of the earlier historical ships. And when I say earlier historical ships, we're talking like 17th, 18th century type stuff. Few honorable mentions I want to make there before we jump into World War I and World War II time period. Once we're done with those time periods, we're going to briefly discuss some more modern ships of the Royal Canadian Navy. Obviously, this being a Canadian museum in Halifax, if some of you aren't familiar with the history of Halifax, it is a rich and diverse history, and I would highly recommend that you do take a look at it. Most notably, the Halifax Explosion, as well as the role that Halifax played during the sinking of the Titanic. That's, some really, really good reads there, really good information to take a look at. So, we'll jump in to the 17th century, and what we're going to look at is the HMS Sovereign of the Seas. So the Sovereign of the Seas was a 17th century warship of the English Navy. She was ordered as a 90-gun first-rate ship of the line by the English Royal Navy, obviously. But at launch time, King Charles I wanted the ship to be fitted with 102 bronze guns. Now, why I thought this ship was so interesting is, as you read, the ship was so elaborately decorated because it's the king's ship, and it cost so much to make at that time that a special tax was levied in order to cover the cost of the ship. And as you read on the little placard there beforehand, that tax was never approved by the Parliament. The king just decided, hey, look, I want a bitchin' ship. I can't afford it right now, so I'm just going to tax the people, and we're going to make this. But it was really, really a nice model ship there. The last sail ship I want to take a look at before we jump into World War I stuff is the HMS Shannon. Does anyone know what the War of 1812 is? And I'm asking this question to my American viewers. So, I just love talking about the War of 1812 because if you weren't aware, Canada did end up going down to Washington, D.C. and burning down that White House. It was, it was something else. Anyway, I don't want to go into the specifics of the War of 1812, but I did want to look at the HMS Shannon. Why I want to look at the HMS Shannon is because it did see naval action during the War of 1812, and I just briefly want to touch on that. So on June 1st, 1813, HMS Shannon went into Boston Harbor. What she found in Boston Harbor was the Chesapeake. This was a 38-gun frigate by the American Navy. And what happened here was really quite interesting. The HMS Shannon immediately started firing upon the Chesapeake. And, battle ensued, ranges closed. And then the Shannon boarded the Chesapeake. And, that's not too uncommon for ships at this time. But what was really, really uncommon, I suppose, was that the Chesapeake was taken in 15 minutes. Yeah, the boarding party of the Shannon was able to capture the Chesapeake and take it within 15 minutes. Within that 15 minutes, 252 sailors were killed or wounded. The Shannon's captain, Philip Brooke, was severely injured in fighting on the forecastle of the Chesapeake. The Chesapeake and her crew were eventually taken to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where the sailors were imprisoned. The ship, the Chesapeake itself, was repaired and taken into service by the Royal Navy. Eventually, she was sold at in Portsmouth, England in 1819 and broken up. However, Philip Brooke did earn himself a Victoria Cross for this action. Yeah, well, you can see the picture up there of the Victoria Cross. Just note that in this early time frame, 1812, 1813, that the Victoria Cross was still being given out with the blue ribbon, as opposed to the red ribbon that you would see nowadays. But I thought that was really interesting. And you can see the pictures I have of this is the captain's chest of the Chesapeake. It was taken sort of as a little war prize and now preserved in the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. Now, jumping more into the time frame of World Warships here, we're going to first take a look at the Mauretania. So the Mauretania is the sister ship to the Lusitania. So if anyone recalls the significance of the Lusitania was the ship that was sunk by the Germans. I think it was U-20 that had sunk it, and it was the reason why the Americans came into the war in the first place. So it was torpedoed by German U-boat U-20 on Friday, the 7th of May, 1915, and there were several Americans on board, and as a result of their death, it was decided that America would now join the war in Europe on the side of the Allies, much to the dismay of the Germans, obviously. So this is the Mauretania. Now, it is one of the largest ship models in Canada. Originally at the museum, this was actually the ship model of the Lusitania. Once the Lusitania had sunk, the model itself was repainted and now appears as the Mauretania. If you look closely, and I didn't get a picture of this unfortunately, but if you look closely in the little lifeboats along the side, you can actually still see that they're branded as Lusitania lifeboats, which is pretty interesting. And some of the pictures you're seeing here as well, you'll notice the ships in their dazzle camouflage. Dazzle during World War I, obviously, and they're looking pretty awesome. Now, in World War I, the Mauretania here, and if her sister ship Lusitania would have survived, these were actually some of the fastest ships in the world, and they were used as armed transports, or armored transports, I should say. So during the course of the First World War, these ships, well, the Mauretania, Lusitania never got the chance, but the Mauretania was able to transport over 900,000 troops and millions of tons of cargo. It wasn't just the Mauretania who did this. These ships were operated by by Cunard Lines, the Cunard family. And actually, in the picture we're looking at here, you can see the ship decked out in its dazzle camouflage. This is actually the Antigua, I think. And in the background, though, do you see the steeple? That is the Cunard family parish. This picture is taken out of Halifax, Nova Scotia as well. So interesting history there. And before we go into World War II ships here, I do want to also touch briefly on the Halifax Explosion, because this is a significant event in Halifax's history. In fact, the explosion itself was so massive and so intense that there are windows in Halifax dating back to 1917 when this happened. It was December 6, 1917. People were standing in front of these windows, going about their daily business. The Mont Blanc, this ship was chartered by France, and it was filled with explosives for the war effort taking place World War I on the Western Front. It collided with a Dutch freighter called the IMO. When this happened, these people who were going about their daily business in their homes, the explosion was so intense that it actually seared the outline of that individual on the window itself. It's insane. You can see it in a number of buildings downtown Halifax that did actually survive the explosion. And it just looks like ghosts walking around, because you can see this dark outline, this dark shade of a human who is standing there when the explosion took place. It etched that into the window. It's insane. It's really, really something that you might want to do some more looking up on and learn something about the history itself. So the collision itself did take place at about 9:04 in the morning. This is Atlantic Standard Time. Approximately 2,000 people were killed when the ships collided and the explosion took place. There were about 9,000 non-fatal injuries, and in fact, when this explosion took place, this was the largest explosion to ever take place on Earth before the testing of atomic bombs. This explosion here was the largest. It's really something to see. The picture we're looking at right now, this is the EMO after the explosion. Obviously the Mont Blanc was just destroyed. The EMO itself, somehow she managed to survive. Here she is beached on Dartmouth. This is the Dartmouth side of the Halifax port. And the last picture coming up for the explosion here is the anchor of the Mont Blanc. We're looking at it right here. This anchor was thrown 2.35 miles. You can see it right here. This is where it landed and where it is preserved today in this monument. So 2.35 miles from the harbor shown into downtown. It's remarkable. Something to behold. And just before we move on into World War II here, just on a personal note, growing up, my grandmother, she passed away when she was 101. And with my grandmother, her being so old, she was born in, I think it was 1902 is when she was born. She and I would recite poetry all the time. I love the arts. She can remember hearing the explosion from where she lived. She lived on Misco Island. This is the most northeastern tip of New Brunswick. I would estimate 700 or 800 kilometers away from where this actually took place, and she's told me that she could hear the explosion. Now, whether or not she could, I don't know, but I would believe her just because she's my grandmother. But yeah, it was a really significant event for everyone in Atlantic Canada when this took place, and I'd highly recommend you guys taking a look at the event itself and learning something here if you've never heard of this event before. So moving into World War II and the exhibits that the museum has, the majority of them do focus on convoys. Convoys were incredibly important as, they were the lifeblood for Britain during World War II and during World War I. Halifax played a huge role in that, especially before the Americans entered World War II. Halifax, St. John's, Newfoundland, and St. John, New Brunswick, were incredibly important. Now, obviously, there were other ports on the east coast of Canada that were used as well: Montreal, Quebec, Cape Breton, for example. So the picture we're looking at here is an early convoy, the layout of it. The larger ships are obviously the escorts. There are some Corvettes in there, destroyers, destroyer escorts. Smaller ships are the cargo ships. And there is a small boat there in the middle. That is a patrol craft that would escort the convoy as far as it could from, as soon as it left port. And these would always come back to port and patrol around. And a sail ship there as well, because you got to remember that in the early opening stages of World War II, the Allies weren't geared up for this. They're using every and any ship. This is a nice model here of a cargo ship that would have typically sailed with the convoys. It's not Liberty class. Not sure the class of the ship, but it is an older cargo ship before the Liberties sort of got on scene, when the Americans, were pumping those out like mad, faster than the Germans could sink them, right? Now, obviously, during World War II, Halifax Port also played a very important role for moving troops over to Great Britain. What we're looking at here, this is the Queen Mary docked at the Halifax Ocean Terminal, loading troops. This is a canard vessel, and they were used to transport troops because they were fast, and this was seen as a great defense against any German U-boats. Now the next ship we're going to look at, this is the Canadian Coast Guard ship Lady Laurier. Lady Laurier was important to the Royal Canadian Navy in that not only would she help out vessels in distress, as you can read here, but she also placed all the Channel war buoys for the Canadian Navy. This was in Shelburne, Halifax, Sydney, St. John's, Newfoundland as well. So what these buoys were, these were actually early sonar buoys used to detect German U-boats. So this would be used to know whether or not there were any German U-boats lurking in the St. Lawrence, for example, or lurking just outside the port of Halifax, outside of the port of St. John's, outside of the port of Cape Breton. So this was a very important ship. You can see her here during wartime. You know, she doesn't get a lot of coverage because, you know, she doesn't have any guns on her, and she didn't actually fight any battles. But without ships from the Canadian Coast Guard, like the Lady Laurier here, you know, it would have been a completely different story in terms of shipping up the St. Lawrence and shipping off the east coast of Canada. So it was vessels like this that really helped protect our coast. The next ship I want to take a look at is the AMC Atlantis. This is the X Goldenfell. So this actually isn't a Canadian ship at all. It is in fact a German ship. And the reason why I wanted to take a look at this ship is when I was in the museum, looking around different exhibits, I saw this here and I had to take a second look. I didn't expect to see a German vessel in the museum. This ship is probably one of the most successful armed merchant raiders in either war. And you can read the placard here. Essentially what it is the boat would go around, or the ship rather, would go around the world. And because you know she's so huge and has lots of stores, she can stay at sea for a very long time. Her job was to raid Allied shipping, either take the cargo aboard or sink the cargo and so that it would never reach its final destination. Over the course of the war, she sank about 145,000 tons of Allied shipping. Now, before we get too carried away, I'll point out here, this ship wasn't meant to, you know, raid convoys, like crossing the Atlantic, right? Like, this ship would have operated at the extreme edges of continents, like South America, bottom of India, and stuff like that, and raid single merchant ships while they're, you know, either on their way back to port to load up again, or they're either on their way to rendezvous with a convoy. So this ship, it didn't actually attack convoys. She was a surface raider who would attack single merchant ships. This was another German ship I found here as well. I mean, originally, you can read on the placard here, she was for Imperial Oil, but she did get captured off the coast of Africa and then started flying the German colors. What I really liked about this ship is it was renamed the Sudetenland. Oh man, I thought that was great. especially considering that it was you know, captured by a German ship and named the Sudetenland. I thought it was great anyway. Oh, good old Germany. Anyway, the ship itself was an oil tanker, and the Germans used it throughout the war. Eventually, though, it was sunk, as the placard mentioned there, in Brest in 1944. She was flying German colors, and it was a Royal Air Force raid that did end up sinking her. So this was a nice model as well. You'll actually notice this model, it was only half a model, and then they placed a mirror on the other side, so you get that mirror image of it. But that's why it looks a little wonky here. But I thought this was a really interesting ship to take a look at as well. Next, what I've got here is the SS Nova Scotia. This was a passenger ship, and you can see, you know, at the placard that we're looking at now, this was one of the ships that was used to help transport British children off of the island and bring over to Canada so that they were safe. So this is the SS Nova Scotia who did this. Unfortunately, later in the war, 1944, the SS Nova Scotia was sunk off the coast of Madagascar with heavy loss of life. But you can see the ship here. I had to take multiple pictures of the ship because it was a large model. Also, there was the museum was packed when I was there. packed. Halifax port had 2 cruise ships who were in port that day, and it was just ridiculous. I tried to take video while I was there as well, but it didn't work out very well. But this is the SS Nova Scotia, and again, I do apologize for some of the poor quality of the pictures. For some of the models, I really had to rush and get there, rush and take the pictures. My sister and niece came along with me, and my sister was saying, my name is Craig, so they're like, Craig, you should just like throw your arms up in the air and say, hey, look, I'm trying to take some pictures for my YouTube channel here. But I was like, no, Amy, I'm not famous enough. No one, they'll just look at me like I'm some sort of crazy person, right? So I tried to make do as best as I could here. Next, we're going to take a look at the HMCS Sackville. It says here the last Corvette. This is the last Flower class Corvette that has been preserved here in Canada, and it is a museum ship that anyone can visit in Halifax. I actually have one of the books that I'm giving away. It's called Unsung Heroes of the Royal Canadian Navy. This is by Cynthia J. Faryon. And I wanted to read a little excerpt out of that book. And again, you guys have a chance to win this book. The chapter is called The Sinking of U-94, Canadian Style. So to set the scene a little here, we've got the HMCS Oakville. This is a Flower class Corvette, and she's hunting the U-94. The Oakville is attempting to ram the U-94, however the U-94 is maneuvering out of ramming distance. So I quote, "Stationed behind the ship's smokestack, 6 stokers who had just not had their part in this battle decide that watching is just not good enough. Dragging out a box of glass pop bottles, the men start yelling curses at the Germans, who are only feet away. They throw the empties at the U-boat. In shock, the Germans stare at these madmen and duck. They're too stunned to shoot at the bottle throwers, but are forced to avoid the glass that is smashing onto the deck of their sub." So this was after the first attempt that the Oakville made at ramming U-94 and narrowly avoided U-94. Looking at the Sackville here in these pictures, you can see that the Sackville is armed with one 4-inch gun that is on the bow. She is armed with some pom-pom guns on the rear. She does have hedgehogs for anti-submarine warfare as well. The hedgehogs actually replaced depth charges. The Flower class still carried depth charges, but it was preferred to use the hedgehogs, as the hedgehogs would detonate on contact, and the depth charges would only detonate at the depth that they were preset. So there's the 4-inch cannon, and there are the hedgehogs right there. You might have noticed too in a few of my videos that some of my thumbnails are Royal Canadian Navy ships. Yep, the Sackville was definitely one of those thumbnails. Now the Flower class Corvettes were a British design of ships which the Royal Canadian Navy adopted. A lot of our ships, we just adopted the British design. Now the Flower class, it was interesting to note in one of the books I have for you here. This is the Corvette Navy by James B. Lamb. Again, you guys have a chance of winning this book. Bit of funny, so the Flower class were named after flowers, right? And so you would end up having ships like the HMS Pansy or the HMS Tulip, for example. Imagine how embarrassed a German submarine commander would be to say, "I got sunk by the HMS Pansy." Yeah. There were efforts to change the names of some of the Corvettes, like from HMS Pansy to something that's a little more manly, maybe? However, not all of them caught on. No official explanation for it, but some historians have speculated that it was because the British sense of humor was that they wanted the Germans to be embarrassed by the names of the ships that were sinking them. It would decrease morale aboard the U-boats, because suddenly you're trying to avoid ships like the HMS Tulip, the HMS Pansy, the HMS Buttercup. Good stuff. Now the last ship that I want to take a look at in today's video is the HMCS Sackville. So this is known as the fastest unarmed warship in the world. The ship itself could do, I think during sea trials, was clocked at 63 knots. The reason for this is the ship was a hydrofoil ship. She was intended to hunt down Soviet submarines during the Cold War. We can see her here. This is one of those grainy pictures I had talked about because there were a number of people behind me wanting to get in on this ship. Very nice looking ship, as you can see here. But like I was saying, she was intended to hunt down Soviet submarines during the Cold War. She was the fastest unarmed ship in the world, clocking out at 63 knots during sea trials. Unfortunately, the Sackville didn't survive Canadian politics, we'll say. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Canadian politics, but we don't have a good history on military development, especially after World War II. Moving into the 60s, it all just falls apart for the Canadian military. But anyway, here we're looking at her now. She is preserved as a museum ship. Now, my French isn't great. However, the location is le Museum Maritime de Québec, and this is at Île-sur-Mer. Yeah, that's the one. So it's the Maritime Museum of Quebec is what it translates to, and this is the island at the sea is what that translates to for you. So you can go there and you can check out the Sackville, and you know, we're looking at more pictures of here. It was really a cool ship. My niece called it the flying boat. Yes, that's, I think my niece is only 3, so but she had called it the flying boat. It was really interesting to see. I had no idea that this ship actually even existed, frankly. I was saddened to learn that it was the Canadian government who stopped using this ship. They just had it too expensive, and during that time in the 70s, there was, within Canadian politics, there was a big push to cut back, right? Where Canada, they said, you know, why do we need this big navy? Why don't we switch to peacekeeping operations? And that's what took place. Who's this handsome devil, you might ask? Well, it's the one and only Thotgor. I thought I'd take a glory shot here in front of the Sackville with the 4-inch cannons and the hedgehogs. Now, to the most important part of the video, I'm sure that all of you have been waiting for. How do we get our hands on the books that Thotgor is giving away? It's really simple. I have a link in my video description, and it's going to bring you to a website, and that website is going to ask you for your email address, your email address, and your first and last name. That's all you have to do. It's very similar to if any of you watch Jingles, the Mighty Jingles, and if you don't, you should, because he's awesome. Side note, there's my sister and my niece. Anyway, she didn't want to wear the hat, but yeah, if any of you have entered into Jingles contest, it's very simple. You click on that link, put in your information, and then I'm going to randomly select 4 people. All I ask is that you are a subscriber to the channel and that you fill out the information. I need to have your email address and your first and last name because I'll be getting in touch with you, congratulating you obviously, and I'll need your address to get these mailed out to you. If it's leaving Canada, then I need to have your first and last name for customs, so that's why I'm asking for that information. So that's how we're going to give away those books. What I'm going to do actually is I'm going to leave them, I'll leave the link up, and I'll leave the contest open for a week. So we're going to leave it run for the next 7 days. So this time next week is when it's going to stop, and then I'll pick the winners, and I'll announce the winners in the video, and then of course I'll get the books mailed out to you guys as well. So thank you in advance for everyone who does participate. Really appreciate it, and of course, you know, thank you to all of my subscribers out there right now. I think I checked and we're up to 54. maybe. So that's really good, actually. I gained quite a few over the weekend. I know I'm nowhere near to that 1,000 mark, but we are getting there, people. All right, so that covers almost everything that I wanted to show you guys in the video from the museum that I had. Just a last picture here, the Atlantic Conveyor. If anyone doesn't know what the Atlantic Conveyor is, I suggest you take a look at the Falklands War. Thank you again very, very much for sticking around, watching the video through. Don't forget to click the link in the video description to enter into a chance to win one of these 4 books. Now, the names of the books again, just before we go. First one I'm giving away, it's called The Corvette Navy, True Stories from Canada's Atlantic War. This is by James B. Lamb. Next, I've got War at Sea, Canada and the Battle of the Atlantic. This is by Ken Smith. I've got Unsung Heroes of the Royal Canadian Navy, Incredible Tales of Courage and Daring During World War II. This is by Cynthia J. Faryon. And I've got Convoys of World War II, Dangerous Missions in the North Atlantic. This is by Dorothy Pedersen. Or Pedersen. Anyway, thank you very much again for watching and sticking around. And tomorrow we'll resume to business as normal, and we'll be taking a look at gameplay. So as always, I do hope you enjoy the rest of your day.